to give an introduction and welcome.
Cool. Thanks so much, everyone. Everyone, I'm John Laird, co-founder and general partner of Workbench. Happy to have everyone. Quick show of hands, who is a first-timer here? It's probably about like 80% of the room. So, for the first-timers here, welcome. Workbench is an enterprise-focused venture fund, but as you see with our broad workspace and the events that we're hosting, we're doing a lot more. We're trying to rethink enterprise VC based on our past lives in corporate IT. I used to work at Morgan Stanley in IT. My colleague Vipin, right there in the back, it's ex-B of A. Jess, my co-founder, is ex-Cisco. And Kelly Mack is somewhere, probably eating the food. He's ex-Forrester. Oh, he's over there. And what we're trying to do is bring a fresh approach where instead of hanging out at the Facebook cafeteria to find whiz-bang tech that ultimately ends up getting pitched to banks, we start with all the Fortune 500 here in New York, learn their pain points, and then we flip them all, and we're thesis-driven to find the best startups solving those pain points. Key to what we do is community and corporate engagement. So we host over 200 meetups a year. So anyway, if you enjoyed tonight's event, which I know you will, Bradford is one of our most incredible speakers and portfolio companies. Be sure to sign up at work-bench.com to our newsletter, and you can stay in touch every week for everything else we have going on. So without further ado, Bradford, come on up.
So I'm just going to take a few minutes for some quick opening remarks before we start the panel. So firstly, Stephen mentioned that some of you were curious, who are these Merlon guys? What do we do? Why are we all here? So Merlon, we started back in 2016 to go after the financial crime compliance space, really in its totality. Whether it's KYC and onboarding, or ongoing monitoring, or transaction monitoring, or payment filtering. I'm really looking at the entire financial crime compliance ecosystem and envisioning a complete end-to-end solution, right? What would the future look like if you redesign this properly from the ground up? And I kind of come from a background at places like Google and building, consumer tech services. And so over there we tend to do, kind of factor out all this commonly used stuff, right? And if you look in compliance tech, when I started to look at the space, I was attracted to it first by the TAM. Obviously, it's a massive market. And then the timing, which has turned out to be really spot on. When we started it in 2016, there's just been this massive wave of change. So I think the timing was there. But what was quite interesting was that all of the solutions are point solutions, and everything is very disconnected, right? And so it's quite an old way of solving these kind of problems. And for example, you could have many different topic models for a risk topic, or many different entity models for matching a name. And these are embedded in all the different systems that are out there. So you might have 20 or 30 different entity matching models. For a big bank like JP Morgan Chase, I'm sure they have actually dozens of entity matching models all over the place, right? And that's just really not a good practice, right? You should really kind of do it once, and you should reuse it, and you should have this as a platform. And so when I looked at this space, I said, wow, somebody's going to really reimagine this and build a proper platform play way of doing financial crime compliance, and sort of eradicate this point solution-oriented way of doing it. And whoever does that is going to have a really huge business. I also like it because it's unsexy, it's massively painful from a go-to-market perspective. The sales cycles are very long, the rollouts are grueling, right? So I hear a lot of laughter, sounds like you guys maybe are actually working in the space. So it's a brutal, especially as John was mentioning, right? It's not attractive to Silicon Valley tech companies. Right, it's there's nothing sexy about it, and the go-to-market is slow and brutal. VCs also don't really like it, right? Because you've got these big elephant hunts and spotty early-stage revenue. So your early revenue is choppy, even though your deal size is maybe $5 million each. You're kind of coming in, slowly. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't attack it, and I think that's what makes it so exciting. I think that's what's made it languish in the sidelines for so long, is that it's not that interesting for many people in the valley to go and attack it, and then meanwhile the ability to penetrate the market is quite hard. So for some reason these worlds of financial crime compliance and deep technology kind of haven't really come together so well before. So that's kind of the story of why I want to go after it. And in terms of what do I see? What have I seen in the past 2-3 years during this experience in machine learning applied to compliance and Regtech? So I think there's been some really interesting stuff. One of the most interesting things has been the evaluation and rollout of these models, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this was kind of shocking to me because I grew up first as a hedge fund guy. I was a hedge fund manager in my early 20s. And I spent the rest of my career at places like Google or building my own startups that have very rigorous production rollout mechanisms, right? Because we're always rolling out models that drive the revenue. And I think that also when you look at the financial crime compliance space, it was kind of the backwaters of banking for a very long time, right? It was really not where the good people were. It didn't have strong budget. There was no real tech there. And then 9/11 hit in this big crisis mode, and then there was all these changes in these companies that came in with various different point solutions that have kind of been weaved together. But by and large, the technology culture in this space is still pretty primitive. And so when you think about how do you test models and roll them out, how do you evaluate them, how do you get machine learning and AI and model people together with the regulators and redefine how some of this stuff works, nothing has happened. So for example, model risk management and model validation, this is stuff which is borrowed from risk models, as in credit risk models, right? So it's not even thought through and designed, in fact, for financial crime compliance risk models. We just kind of stole the methodology and applied it here. So I think there's a lot of rethinking that clearly needs to be done in applying deep technology to regulatory landscape in banking. And so far, from what I've seen, the evolution of the culture and the practices is quite slow. So I think even though the technology is there, that the biggest problem in the space, the problems that I've seen in the space are actually people problems, mostly. And then the infrastructure problems are just the legacy internal IT stacks that the banks have. So you have this mix of the rollout is slow because of people issues, and then the rollout is slow because of a sort of deploying into a legacy technology environment. And I think that although there's the hunger to adopt AI solutions has progressed much faster than I thought. So this was the counterintuitive thing. When we started in 2016, this was sort of pretty radical, and people were very skeptical about it initially. We had many pitch meetings where people were like, get out of here, you're just one of these naive tech guys and you think you can do this stuff. And now everybody is embracing, everybody is buying, people have RFPs out like crazy, people are all over it. So I probably massively underestimated how quickly this transformation would happen in terms of people's appetite to buy and adopt these solutions. But then I also probably underestimated the time it would take for these cultural evolutions and also the IT stack evolutions. So even though the banks, they talk about cloud, they talk about doing containers and Kubernetes internally and stuff, the real deploy story isn't there, right? So even though they're theoretically there, right, the actual deploys are not happening into those environments rapidly enough at most banks. So the reason I'm giving this narrative is this question of impact. That's what we're going to talk about on the panel today. And so for me, it's this double-edged sword. I think the impact is somewhat neutral right now, because on the one hand, the adoption is there, the aggressiveness to buy and attack these problems is there. People see the business case, they want to reduce false positives, they want to drop headcount, they see that they're missing risk. So all that narrative is there. So from an impact perspective on awareness, it's there. But adoption and rollout, I think, is happening way slower than probably most of us in this room would like to see. So that's something I hope we can talk about on the panel. But anyways, I'll be quiet now. That's my intro. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Bradford. Penny, if you'll come up. Penny's going to share some thoughts, and then we'll get into our panel. Penny Crossman, most of you know her. She's the editor at large at American Banker, and we're just so grateful to have you here moderating our panel. But you have some thoughts as well that you wanted to share, and
Sure.
give you the mic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. This is a really nice crowd. This place has a really nice vibe tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Unlike Brad, I need a cheat sheet because I kind of scribbled some thoughts down. I was asked to come up with 5 things that I think are sort of new or interesting in the AI in Regtech, which we're mostly going to talk about AI in AML, so catching money launderers, terrorists, human traffickers, people like that. One thing that I think was kind of interesting is the regulators came out, the bank regulators came out last December and said, hey, it's okay to use AI in your AML systems because it had been a big question mark up until that point. But when I talk to bankers, they're still very concerned about what does that really mean? When they actually come in and examine us and look at what we have, are they going to be laissez-faire? Are they going to cast aspersion? We're going to talk about this, but for instance, if your new AML system uncovers a big money laundering ring that's been going on for 5 years, are your regulators going to say, hey, you screwed up, we're fining you $10 million or whatever. And on the other hand, they're worried about what if our new AI system produces fewer red flags, but better red flags, but then you're only submitting 100 suspicious activity reports, and this other bank is submitting 500 suspicious activity reports. What are the regulators going to say to that? Are they going to say you're not trying hard enough? So they have all these questions around how is this going to work and how is it going to be deployed, and are they really going to live up to the statement that they made in December that we're open to this? Another shift I'm seeing is I'm hearing banks talk about really ripping and replacing what they have and putting in systems like Merlon's AI. Up until now, they've had these AML systems that look at all the transactions that come in the bank and red flag anything that's like of a certain size, or it's someone who's been going from Pakistan to Iraq a lot, or things like whatever they consider the red flags to be. And what they've been doing is just taking, the banks have been taking the data from their existing systems and then putting them into a new system like Merlon, there's a few others, and then seeing what happens. But some of them are starting to talk about actually getting rid of what they have, putting in something new, taking a really fresh look at all of the activity, all the transactions that happen, and a new way of looking for suspicious patterns and letting the AI engine do what it should do better than what they have. Another trend I'm seeing is regulators in other countries have been far outpacing the US regulators when it comes to innovation. You have regulators in the UK and Hong Kong and Singapore that have been really, really forward-thinking, at least as opposed to the US regulators. And they have, about 20 countries have fintech sandboxes where fintech companies can come and start issuing products without too much fear of retribution, at least if they kind of play within the guardrails that they have. And there's just been more of an openness toward new ideas, new companies. In the US, we're so conservative. It's been much harder, but we're starting to see some change. I think on the capital market side, we've seen some change. We're seeing SEC and FINRA are using AI to watch trading activity and watch the capital markets. Another trend is that we're starting to see fintech sandboxes emerge, and I already mentioned that Arizona was the first state to have one, and they have like a handful of companies that are using it. They basically use it for economic reasons. They want to draw businesses to their state, so they're saying we have this nicer environment. You can come in and launch your product, and we'll sort of help you out. They do have to put a lot of disclosures on their products. So they have to say, this is for a limited time only, this is like a test product, it's going to disappear. So, there are some drawbacks to that. And then, my fifth point was that banks in other countries are starting to see remarkable results from this kind of technology, the use of AI in looking at money laundering, I spoke to a bank called OCBC in Singapore. They've been using AI for several months. They've seen a 35% reduction in alerts that they generate, while their accuracy has increased 4 times. So, that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to start seeing in the United States, pretty soon. So that's what I had. Let's welcome the panelists up so we can start our panel discussion. All right, so I probably don't need to introduce Bradford. Let me just see if there's something you didn't say. Well, Bradford's also a partner at a venture capital firm called DCVC. It's a machine learning and big data venture capital fund. He's founded 2 machine learning startups since 2009. He also, one of them was called Prismatic. It used machine learning for personalized content ranking and natural language processing for topic classification. Another one was called Flightcaster, and they use machine learning to predict the real-time state of the global air traffic network using FAA carrier and weather data. And I think you mentioned you're a hedge fund investor as well. So quite varied experience there. And we have Jeff Bandman in the middle. He's principal at Bandman Advisors. He's also the co-founder of Global Digital Finance, which is an advisory practice that helps clients ranging from startups to global firms. Also works with financial institutions at times, helping them deal with regulators. We were just talking about that. And he's also a lecturer in global affairs at Yale, and he lectures on things like blockchain and cryptocurrency, and also he puts together interesting seminars for students on the future of technology and how it's going to affect their lives, especially financial technology. And he was also a senior official at the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission from 2014 to 2017. So he's going to bring a really valuable regulator perspective to all of these questions. So we're fortunate to have that. And we have Arindam Chowdhury, who is Global Head of Banking and Capital Markets at Capgemini. I don't have a long bio. He previously worked at Capco and data consultancy services, and he's kind of focused on big data and insights and making sure that you have the right data as you start to use these technologies. Because if your data is wrong, the output is going to, garbage in, garbage out, right? So that's kind of a focus there. So I guess our main question, well, let's start with the regulator question. I brought up the fact that the regulators came out and said, well, all the major US regulators came out and said, it's okay to use innovative technology, including artificial intelligence. But they didn't say, we won't go after you if something bad emerges out of it. So what's your take on that? Are they going to lighten up, or what do you think is going to happen with the regulators' attitude?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, the regulator's job is, obviously, they have missions in terms of financial stability, customer protection, making sure that the safety and soundness of financial institutions, and they have a number of different missions. So, they are going to pursue those missions regardless. But, to the first part of the question, I think regulators are, trying very hard to wrap their arms around the new technologies like AI. There's really 2 perspectives on it. One of them is the utilization of these technologies by the firms that they regulate, the industries that they regulate, the banks and others, and then they're also very attuned to, many of the financial institutions use third-party vendors and even, fourth-party vendors who are vendors to those vendors. So they're kind of on top of that ecosystem. There's also utilization of AI and other technologies by the regulators themselves, and Penny kind of alluded to that, whether it's for detection of financial crime or market surveillance. At the CFTC where I worked and was responsible for leading a staff working group that started monitoring fintech and blockchain and virtual currency developments, and then we launched about 2 years ago, in kind of mid-2017, Lab CFTC, which is the CFTC's innovation hub. These represent actual concerted efforts by the regulators to understand the regulations, to have points of contact around innovation, and to have a real two-way street around these things. So they're announcing programs, they're dedicating resources, they're putting structure around it, and like the announcement that Penny alluded to about sort of using digital tools for AML KYC, they're trying to make the public understand it's okay to experiment with them, but the expectation is going to be that it's risk-based and proportionate. And I'm going to mention one other thing that I think is relevant to this, which was on February 11th, there was an executive order from the president about AI. It directs, I brought a copy of it here, someone can have it after the program if they want, but it actually directs federal agencies to do sort of a stock take to figure out what their capabilities are, what data they have, what algorithms they're using to adopt programs. And I know from a recent visit to Washington about a week after this came out, some of my former colleagues are actively thinking, how can we implement and execute this order? And there are, specific timeframes within which they're supposed to develop programs that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later. In the program, it directs NIST to develop standards around AI, which I think is very important. So I think, we're seeing a lot of activity and commitment and resource that will, help promote this evolution.
So banks don't need to have, what about those specific fears of having too few suspicious activity reports, or of uncovering something that was sort of under the surface before?
Yeah, I think these things don't change overnight. And I think also, as firms start to develop or evolve their compliance programs, so for example, if there's a greater reliance on automated processes and less on manual, I think there's a general understanding that, the process of getting suspicious activity reports that are on PDFs and fax, that people are sorting through these things manually, is not an efficient way to detect financial crime and to process this information. But you still have to show that you're doing something better, and that if in adopting the new technologies and the new methodologies, that you're not missing out. And does that have to be 100%? I think that's to be determined. But I think you need to show you have kind of processes and safeguards around it. But they're definitely listening.
Well, let's. Oh, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just want to add on. So I think one point or a couple of points are made, right? So I think one is the regulators have very much grown up in the rules-driven world, and they really understand the rules, which are well documented. And when something is flagged as suspicious, they know why exactly it's been flagged as suspicious. I think we had a couple of years in between where the AI-driven models were more like black box, right? So they would flag something as suspicious or flag something as a false positive, but then how do you prove that it is a true false positive, right? So I think one thing to keep in mind is the proof or the burden of providing the proof still rests with the banks and still rests with the software vendors who are operating in this space. So what we are starting to see now is a lot of investment in explainable AI, where you can actually explain what the recommendation provided by the AI model, how did it come about, and what are the variables that actually impacted it, right? And I think you also need to prove that you are doing or you are providing outputs or false positives, which is at least as good as the rules-driven systems, right? So I would say that at least for another year or so, you would see the AI-driven systems as being very much complementary to the rules-driven systems. And then once there is a confidence established, they're at least at par, if not better, right, with the rules-driven systems. That's when you're going to start seeing people start to swap out the applications.
So Bradford, you earlier described how brutal and painful and slow all of this work is. What's the positive side? What are some of the wins that are happening, and how is this starting to help the banks and eventually help all of us in stamping out crime?
There's a positive side? No, I'm just kidding. No. Yeah, so I think the mission here is really powerful, and it's very important because with these businesses that are like, let's say, 2 or 3 degrees removed from their mission, it can be very easy to lose sight of this, right? But in the end of the day, like take the BNP Paribas story, right, which we all know is a $9 billion fine, right, which is the top line number that we see in the news. But the reason it's a $9 billion fine is because they sponsored genocide. Like they financed genocide. Like this is really, really horrible. And if you really study the story, I've actually started to work on an essay about it because of the issue I'm going to talk about in a second. You see, wow, this was really bad, and the behavior of the executives at BNP Paribas was really unexcusable. Like they should have shut the bank down. It's like disgusting, absolutely wretched. And stopping this kind of stuff is super important and impactful in the world, right? So the mission around what financial crime compliance is trying to do, the behavior that it's stopping, is really important, right? This isn't stealing like fraudsters are stealing, right? It's a very vanilla, transactional, like financial game, right? These people already have the money, right? And they've gotten it by dubious means, and they're using it for even more dubious means. So this is really bad stuff. So the mission is great, and the impact that you want to keep connected to that positive impact that we have and that mission that we have. But it's very easy to get distracted by it because, you know, in the end, it's like you're dealing with bankers and they seem very transactional, right? And then you're dealing with all these rollout issues, and then that is very frustrating, and you're sort of like multiple degrees removed from the actual like mission and impact that you originally kind of thought about. So I think that's a problem for all of us in the space, is like, how do we constantly remind ourselves of our positive mission and impact as we get bogged down in these day-to-day details, which make us lose sight of that. So I think the important work here is extremely like valuable to society, and it's part of this world where the nation-state actors like reach through industry in order to conduct their activities. And it's happened in finance. Like, for example, we're in a mode of financial warfare, right? Like nation states use sanctions for financial warfare, actually. It's written about, like there's books about this, right? So it's actually a political and warfare strategy. So it's not only about catching these bad actors and whatnot, but actually the governments around the world are implementing this as a core part of their statecraft. So you basically are engaged in this world where the financial institutions play a pivotal role in geopolitics and also in crime fighting activity. So these are really powerful, very important things, but it's easy to get distracted from the mission, I think, because there's just so much stuff to distract you.
A long haul. Can any of you think of any specific examples where an AI system has actually caught a bad activity?
I can tell you about some, but I can't share them, right? But like, yeah, I mean, absolutely, you see bad people that folks aren't catching in banks all the time. I think you just need to think about, you know, what are the kinds of failures that are going to let risk through, right? So like an easy example that we see in media screening is that is like false matches on names, or inability to match a name, right? So if you have a different permutation of a name, and then the name is only referred to later by the surname or something else, then you're just going to utterly miss the article. If you have a long tail scenario where you have a bad actor and it's not a famous person, right, then you could easily just onboard this bad actor now. So I think there's clear cases, in particular with what I would call the beefy problems in financial crime compliance. And these are the two big dogs here are the transaction monitoring system and then the adverse media screening, right? So the rest of the stuff is largely like simpler, like list matching type problems and stuff like this. It's not nearly as easy to let really bad stuff through, right? So It's much easier to, and of course these systems generate tons of false positives, but the bad stuff is going to tend to be in there more, right? The difficulty of catching bad stuff in a problem like negative media screening or like transaction monitoring is a far larger degree of difficulty. So I think that this is where you see a lot of bad stuff come through. And I think, like, to your point, this is actually a great question. If you retroactively, if you do like a look back, right, using modern technology, if you did a look back for EDD using media screening and other tech, and then you did a look back for monitoring, again using monitoring tech, you're definitely going to find a lot of bad stuff. Of course, in a bank the size of JP Morgan Chase or Morgan Stanley or something, you're going to find loads of bad stuff. So I think this is a great question, right? So like, okay, what if we did that? You know, do the regulators get to go after those guys? Because I can tell you for sure, from a modeling perspective, there's loads of bad stuff, and we'll definitely find it if we did a look back. So, I don't know.
I mean, I think, outside of traditional financial crime, an area where also there are kind of concrete, well-publicized examples are around kind of cryptocurrencies where there's a visible, transparent ledger on the blockchain. And so there was an exchange or a trading platform in Japan that got hacked a number of years ago called Mt. Gox. And hundreds of thousands of bitcoins, which at the time were worth $200 to $400, and now even in crypto winter are worth 4,000. But so hundreds of thousands of them were recovered, and it took multiple years. But the investigators were able to follow kind of the trail and then see kind of network patterns and dynamics. The advantage in that particular area is because there's visible ledgers, but then there's also techniques, but then people do network analysis and so on. And so they actually recovered hundreds of thousands of these. They captured the alleged culprit, or culprits, or ring of culprits, and they've actually, people who thought they had lost all their money years ago are now getting paid off. So, there are, some of these techniques, I think, that have been developed in the context of financial crime are now starting to be applied even in, kind of frontier areas like blockchain and cryptocurrency transactions.
And Arvind too. Can you tell us just to explain a little bit what AI can do that these existing systems that are out there can't do?
Yeah. And so I'm just going to piggyback on the last question, right? And I'll give you some examples. So I think, and Bradford mentioned about entity matching, right, and entity resolution. And, firms have been at it for so long. I think they have, by and large figured it out. And, if you have similar sounding names or, names which are, spelled slightly differently, there are systems out there today which can actually resolve that. And I don't think that is the true value of AI. I think, the true value really comes in kind of matching different sorts of things, right? So, for example, you could start matching behaviors. So, you could be onboarded today as, Rhythm, and tomorrow you will get onboarded as Jack because you got banned, as a Rhythm. But then the system should be able to match the payment patterns or the behavioral patterns and say, hey, this looks familiar. And, we flagged it last time, so let's dig a little deeper on this entity that we just onboarded and look at who is the ultimate, beneficiary of this account, right? And then you figure out, hey, it's the same bad actor, right? So that's one example where AI can be very effective. I think the second thing, right, which I think most people are not doing today, is you do a ton of validation when you're doing the CDD and the EDD, right? But you're not doing anything to really make sure that people are complying with those agreements when they were onboarded. Okay, so you submit a bunch of documentation, you submit a bunch of, you sign a bunch of documentation and say that this is what I'm going to do, these are the accounts that I'm going to deal with at the time of onboarding to get through the door. But who is actually making sure that you're constantly compliant with that, right? And if your legal stature is changing, who is going back and actually updating those things? So that's where, again, AI can be much more effective than traditional technologies.
So, I think, like I said, that the more, I agree with the point, the more complex the problem and the things that you're trying to match or identify, then the greater the lift that you'll see from machine learning, right? So, for example, this entity match problem, right? Yeah, people have worked on it for a very long time. There's lots of like these fuzzy matching engines out there and stuff. And so like the results are reasonable. The AI adds value when you start to do things like, okay, I've got a common name, I've got John Smith, right? But this John Smith, we know where they're from, we know their age and stuff, and so there's lots of other things I could look at in a media article that tell me if this is the same John Smith or not. So you start to go from an entity match to an identity match, and it starts to become interesting for machine learning to weed out like the false positives of these common names. But this is a trivial example. The really interesting ones are, like I said, like media, right? Where it's like, okay, it's a name match, but then it's also a topic match and it's also a relation, right? So this is the person, this is the bad thing, the person has done the bad thing, or they've been convicted of the bad thing. And this is where it gets complex. In Brazil, if you've been accused of anything bad, then you're probably just rich. Everybody rich has been accused of bad stuff in Brazil. So if you talk to a private bank and there's onboarding citizens in Brazil, then their risk appetite usually includes anybody who's been accused of anything, right? Because it's irrelevant. In the US, you don't get accused of fraud very often unless you're up to some bad stuff, right? They're not trivially going around and accusing people of fraud in the press. In Brazil, that's not the case. It's actually fairly normal. But actually, like, there's this notion of how far the allegation has progressed. If you've been convicted of fraud, indeed, this is quite bad, even in Brazil, right? So you need to understand these nuance, and this is, again, sort of more of a machine learning problem where you've got an entity over here, you've got a topic of bad stuff over here that you can identify in the text, and I can see semantically how they're linked, and I can tell you, this is an article you want to review. This is probably the person. This is definitely really bad stuff, and I'm almost certain that this person has been actually convicted of this bad stuff. So this becomes now something that really is way outside the bands of my risk tolerance, and I want to look at this article first. And I think, again, you see this kind of stuff with transaction monitoring where, to your point, very complex patterns that you're trying to match. Right, and the FFIC red flag rules and all these other red flags rules all over the world are very trivial. It's a separate code, a separate discussion about why these should be code and not these fuzzy things that they are now. But ultimately, these generate massive amounts of alerts, right? And the way to kind of escalate the ones that really need the human eyes on is really a complex problem. Right, like you can resolve some of the really trivial, silly ones, like this person. This is like a systematic wire that happens every month, right? This should just be suppressed. We know this client. This isn't a matter of them doing their business. Versus something that's very complicated that involves network analysis, and I need to link in the person's identity and see stuff about their risk profile and follow the participants in the transaction graph and see, this is a transaction with this other sub, and if I look up at the parent company of the sub, now I see that there's a beneficial owner of this, who looks sketch and has committed some, transaction in the past with this other, entity that we found that is definitely associated with unbankable individuals. So, this is what you see when you go into the layer, right, of the hardcore financial crime investigation folks, and you go into their layer and they have the maps up and pins and they're following stuff all around, right? This is the machine version of that, right? Let's take them straight to the risk and just show them, directly, here's the risk, right? You don't have to go build all these maps and stuff. We've done that for you. Just investigate it here. So I think this is where the hugest wins are, and the other stuff are much simpler, but adverse media screening and enhanced due diligence, and I think the transaction monitoring side is where we'll see huge industry changing, blockbuster wins.
So I thought it was interesting that you brought up everybody in Brazil who's rich can be considered a fraudster, because one thing I always wonder is, if you're just looking at patterns, could an innocent person have a pattern that looks like a suspicious person. You know, maybe I go to Pakistan a lot. Maybe I have a cousin who's in ISIS. You know, or could there be a danger of you know, looking for these connections and then finding something that's, you know, that's not.
Yeah. Oh, my poor Pakistani brothers and sisters, man. It's like everybody will pop on right. It's like it's like because they all have very similar names, right? So it's really tough. I think that you know, there's serious issues with this. I don't think it's going to lead to like a lot of these weird, like, you know, false, you know, attacks on people or whatever. I'm much more worried that it's just creates massive amounts of noise and work for people, right? And especially around these, like, some of these common names in certain languages, it's hugely problematic. But in terms of like AI identifying like a pattern, and then you know, people are going after folks and so on, I don't think this is going to happen. I think that this is overblown. I think in China this stuff's going to happen because they brazenly don't care about human rights, and they do like this surveillance state stuff. So there's definitely going to be some nasty crackdowns that we'll see in China. There'll be a lot of good stuff, like good doctors already using AI to do diagnosis for patients at scale of 200 million patients, right? So Ping An is doing stuff that will blow everyone's mind. If you haven't paid attention to them, you definitely should. But on the other side, like there's going to be all these AI models that are triggering a lot of these really, you know, unfortunate actions. In the US, I don't think this will happen very much. And I think the big reason why is that AI is not about automating everything. It's about levering up the humans, right? So we'll surface the stuff and we will make these mistakes, but I think the humans will correct it. I think where there's no human in the loop to correct it and people try to naively push for full automation, this is where you're going to see some really disastrous results like the worry that you're proposing.
Just to add a little bit on that, you know, I think the other trend that we're seeing right now is the probability of bias in AI, right? Because, you know, the historical data that has been used by the machine learning models is probably, you know, biased.
Yes.
Okay? And is biased on a number of factors like, you know, age and sex and, you know, race and so on and so forth. So we are actually doing some work on, you know, looking at models and looking at the outcome of the models and detecting if there are biases within the models, right? And we can tell, hey, check for, you know, sex. Is there bias based on sex in this model? And it's going to give you a number, spit out a number and say that, you know, there's a 4% bias, right? And then there are different methodologies that we're using to kind of validate those models and check those models for bias. And I think this is going to become something which is more commonplace, and I think, you know, regulators are also going to start asking for, you know, those kind of proof points, in addition to, you know, having like explainable AI.
And maybe just to stay on you for a minute, so isn't data a part of that too? Because it's, you know, it seems like with a lot of the famous examples of like facial recognition not working properly, it's because you've got a smaller data set of people in this race and the majority, a much bigger data set of people in that, you know, that race, and then your model is just going to be much more effective for the people in the majority. You know, from your perspective, how do you solve for that? That you're going to have, you know, minority groups, or you're going to have splinter groups of people that you don't have as much information about?
No, I think that's the holy grail, right? And I think what banks and everybody is trying to do is really create like more apps where, you know, you create that immersive experience, right? And a bank is no longer a bank, but it is also, you know, your financial advisor, and it's also, you know, helping you book hotels and, you know, book your travel and so on. The idea behind all of it is to really collect, you know, as much interaction data as you can, right? Because the more data you have, your models are going to be better, right? So that's kind of one part of it. The second part of it, and I know, you know, Bradford mentioned earlier that banks are not quite there in coming to, you know, terms with the adoption of these models, right? And that problem is, you know, because of the legacy, right? The burden of legacy that these guys carry is humongous, right? So, you know, I was talking earlier about a bank that we're working with have, you know, 20,000 Teradata stores, right? So how do you figure out what is your right source of data? Because, you know, as you mentioned, garbage in, garbage out, right? What is your single source of customer? Every bank that is represented here, I can guarantee you have at least 12 customer masters at a minimum that you know of, right? And there are probably 30 others that you don't even know of, right? So which one do you select, right? And which one do you pick from? So that's kind of another challenge, right? So really having to solve kind of the data quality problem, and you know, interestingly enough, AI is also helping solve data quality problems. It's very similar kind of concept, right? You're moving from a rules-driven world. How many rules can you write, right? To move to AI to detect data quality problems and start fixing those data quality problems. So AI is actually going to even help rescue you from that, the data problem, if you will, right?
So let's go back to Bradford, and then we'll go back to the regulatory side. So you started to bring up how AI changes the way people work, and you said there needs to be a human in the loop in every case, which I thought was interesting, because a lot of people think of AI as killing jobs. How do you see AI changing the nature of work in this area specifically, and or in general?
Yeah, I think a lot of people say a lot of stuff about AI that haven't been building systems for 20 years, so they're learning the stuff the hard way now, whereas I already have several of these battle scars from these naive moments in my earlier career. So I think, you know, listen, this stuff's really hard, especially for complex problems like we're dealing with here in financial crime compliance, or many of the other kinds of problems that I've seen and worked on over the years. So it's like if you're serving an ad, or you're doing an Amazon recommendation, or you're doing like a retargeter, right? I mean, we've all, you know, you buy a toaster and you can't get away from the toaster, right? Online, you go, look this way, there's a toaster, look this. We don't know. I just had a discussion with some of my team in Europe, and somebody was talking about fixing this toaster problem. We had this very interesting pub discussion about it, which got quite lively. And I brought up the point that perhaps actually that if you've bought a toaster, you are actually more likely to buy another toaster. And that, you know, because the assumption that the team had was that this was like wrong, right? That this was following you around, but they didn't know that you already bought a toaster, right? And I said, well, perhaps they do know that you've bought a toaster, and perhaps you're more likely to return it and buy another toaster. You don't know. And they said, wow, you know, never thought about that, right? Maybe they are more likely to buy a second toaster, right? This is like, right. So I think we understand very little about these systems right now, and there are so many counterintuitive things like this example that I just gave, which is obviously silly, but you can see my point, right? And I think that these are going to require humans in the loop for a very long time. Also, frankly, want them for labeling. Like you know, the way we do things to get to the data point is like, I've learned over the years to not trust corporates and their data, so I just don't trust it at all. People think that there's these data lakes, right? People have been talking about the data lake for 10 years. There's a lot of lakes, there's no data in the lakes. That's the problem, right? So it's like, you know, I don't know what you're supposed to do, right? It's like, yeah, you gotta drain the data swamp or whatever, right? So I think the thing is that you've got to create it yourself. So even for us, for whether it's like the adverse media screening or the transaction screening or payment filtering, we actually contract out to the FCC compliance firms ourselves. PwC, our friends at Capgemini, all these folks, like, these are who the banks are contracting out to. We'll just label the data ourselves, right? And we'll do it in a way that's super thoughtfully curating the data to be fed into models. The data inside the corporates is largely rubbish. As you mentioned, it's all over the place. It needs to be cleaned up. It was never captured to be used for models. And you have no idea if the people that were actually clicking and doing these things were competent or paying any attention at all, right? So if we can cherry pick highly competent people, have them really be trained to properly label stuff to be fed into the machine learning models, and then now you can bootstrap a really high performing, high quality system. And then you can start to get the feedback going inside the bank, right? Then I'm happy to have people clicking on stuff and doing their thing and constantly training the system. So I think the way that it changes how people works, it's that it's levering folks up, right? So that the manual work that they would have needed to do to prepare to make a final decision is taken away from them, but I still want them to make the final decision. and I want them to tell me if the model was correct or if the model was incorrect. And very importantly, if the model was incorrect, I want to know why, right? Did we miss the ID match? Is this not even about this topic at all? Are these two things not connected, right? And that's the problem. I want to know what that issue is. That's going to be how I make my models better. So I think the way that you change your work is you're still doing the work, but you're not doing any of this manual gathering of stuff. You're just kind of decisioning. But then I also think there's an education and training component where you want the people to kind of understand a little bit about the system that they're interacting with. Because you do see, in many cases, profound confusion, lots of questions, and so on. So I think designing the interfaces to be intuitive and thinking about the training and education is very important, because even if it's easy for them to kind of use the system, you want them to understand how to provide feedback to the model, because I think the way your role changes, right, where half the value you're creating has nothing at all to do with this one task. It has to do with the compounding effect of what you're doing that influences your models, right? And that's a major mindset shift and totally different from what happens today, because you're basically saying, I want to keep, job loss, I think there will be job loss, because I think what you see is I want to keep my elite staff, I want the people who are paying attention, I want to do A/B tests and round robins, and I want to see who are my people that are going, always letting risk through and not really paying attention, right? And I'm catching them in the line of defense. That person's not paying any attention to their job, right? So you don't want them there. Keep the good ones that are paying attention, and they're gonna train the system to be better and better over time. So I do think there will be job loss, but I don't think it's about eradicating all these jobs and automating everything away. I think in all these fields where you see this rich application of machine learning and it actually works, it's gonna be this 80-20 rule where you keep the top 20% that are really clued in and doing the work, and the other ones are going to have to find a career path where they can get serious about it. Because I think AI basically will automate away every job where people are not really into the job and it's pretty mechanical. Then I think those are exactly the roles where there's no story for those being around.
80%, that's pretty high.
So maybe just to take maybe a less dystopian perspective on how these things can unfold. My colleague is has more conviction that the way he anticipates the world going, is confident that is in fact how will turn out, and I think we'll see. But I worked on, I think soon be publishing kind of a white paper about an experiment that was done in the Financial Conduct Authority, the UK Regulators kind of innovation program, and what that involved was a Regtech, machine learning, AI, and I'd say also there was an augmented intelligence component. So, with AI, people talk about artificial intelligence, but in this case, I'm going to come back to this concept of augmented intelligence, right? So, what the purpose of the experiment was, there's this massive statute in Europe, this new regulation called MiFID II, which is just this massive, sprawling, diabolical thing that is very large and complex for financial institutions to comply with. And so these two global banks that had UK operations tested, well, what if we have this tech ingest the regulation? Can it sort of define regulatory profiles of these entities, and then can it actually figure out what the obligations are that go with it? And in fact, some of this, and they'd actually already done a lot of this work and created what they call traceability matrices. So, kind of unlike the issue that Arvind referred to where you don't really know how to benchmark, in this particular experiment, there actually was a benchmark that had been developed independently by people who didn't realize that, it was going to be tested against something else later. They thought this big regulation was coming. And so, I think one of the, looking at what the machine did well and, what it did less well, I think what it demonstrated, so I was talking to the guys from the technology company, I said, this kind of reminds me a bit of, I started my career as a lawyer, and it's sort of like, in the law firm, you've got the paralegals, and you've got the associates and the partners, and the kind of the paralegals flag things where they notice, ambiguities or uncertainties, and they bring them to the associates, and then they flag them to the partners. And that really seemed to be kind of the workflow that was happening here, that they were, some things that, and maybe they were kind of the more routine things, but it wasn't like they were all there, and because you're dealing with laws, and laws are written by people, there's always interpretations, and there were things that didn't match or required interpretation, or were just some of the eccentricities of this. And so, I think, kind of the feeling of the people involved was not that, well, all the people who worked on this will be gone, but the functions that they will perform will be different, and they actually will do kind of, more interesting work, and, their understanding of the banks or the institutions and its functions will be very relevant in order to help them. But, this technology will do kind of the initial cut and surface the issues, and then these people will be more like the associates or the partners, as opposed to just out on the street, hoping that you give them a job doing something else.
So everyone gets promoted? Is that what you're saying?
I think just the nature, who knows, right? But the nature of the work that they'll be doing, some of the kind of repetitive tasks, where the machine can be trained to do it more. So I agree, that's part of the concept. But, you'll have this, I think you won't go straight from manual to, kind of artificial intelligence, but you'll have this sort of augmented intelligence where kind of man and machine work together. And I think there's going to be kind of this partnership, and I hope it lasts, all of our lifetimes at least.
What do you think about the future of work? What percent of jobs will be eliminated by AI?
That's a pretty black and white question, right? So no, I think I agree with the assertion that in the short term it's definitely going to get more interesting. The work done by humans is going to get more interesting. So just talking about the AML context, right? Already some of the automation that we're seeing is at the back end of AML. So if you flag like a suspicious activity report, every time an analyst needs to generate a narrative saying what happened and what really transpired and why is this being flagged. So what's already happening is, AI is generating that narrative. So what was really boring and mundane, AI is doing it for you, right? So you really get to then focus on, the behavioral forensics, right? So the work is definitely getting more interesting. The mundane stuff is going to get automated. My guess, if you were to point a gun at me, I would say 30% in the short term. But, I can see it going to 80% in a couple of years because the algorithms are definitely getting better, So even when it comes to translating regulatory documents with NLP, the advances in NLP, it's only going to get better.
Right. Yeah, but let me just to add one thing to that. So, I think also to kind of think about, and from the regulators as well as from society, that in a static world that might be the case, but I think you'll also have, what I would consider kind of an era of rising expectations. Where, as the capability of technology to assist the AML, KYC, or other important regulatory or surveillance or compliance functions occur, then there will be an expectation that the institutions are using those tools, and so the regulators' expectations will go up. And you could say, well, this is really unfair, it's moving the goalpost, but, I think that's been the history, that as technology has enabled greater efficiencies. And I'll give, to me, I think one example, is, around kind of sampling in the case of kind of compliance and monitoring voice communications. And, historically, and, I've been general counsel of a firm that had a brokerage desk in my kind of, early career. And, the way, we had to look, to monitor behavior, whether the brokers were saying inappropriate things or encouraging or discouraging or whatever, we had to have somebody go and, listen to these hours and hours of tapes. And, they could have skills because you could figure out, what was going on, and you could sort of match it to the time of a trade or something else. But it was kind of a manual process. And then to demonstrate that you were monitoring for something to the regulator, you'd say, well, we did sampling and we did this and we did that. But as technology has developed, that allows kind of voice recognition and voice to text and some of these other techniques, and then those kind of get trained. That says, well, maybe sampling was good enough before, but maybe now that you've converted voice to text and text can be understood and you have these arcane vocabularies, then there's an expectation. Oh, well, are you using the tools to try to detect these things, and maybe you do some sampling and do something else. So I think that with this kind of evolving standards, we'll mean that there will be plenty of work to do.
Great.
I just want to say one thing about this because I think it's a really important thing to distinguish here the strategic long-term thing versus the short-term tactical thing. And I think an important note that you see in the wild, right, is like at the end of the day, the majority of the business cases that people are writing up to buy this software are headcount reduction business cases. Like that's just the bottom line. And the reason why is because they're operating on top of a highly inflated headcount from this past like 5-10 years of like hiring binge. So I don't think it's that like these jobs have kind of been sitting there and now they're going to go away. The story is actually quite a bit different. It's like the job that's a hockey stick of headcount, right? And then the banks are just dying. Like they're just getting crushed by this. And so they all have these initiatives to try to like somehow moderate this so that you could grow revenue. Like even if you could just grow headcount linearly with revenue, just that would be a win, right? Like they can't grow headcount even it's growing super linearly with revenue, and that's toxic. It's not going to work. And so I think that the short-term tactical thing is like, how do we get out of this toxic cycle where headcount in compliance literally grows super linearly with revenue? Because that's non-sustainable, right? And so I think we have to fix that and create a sustainable situation for the compliance ecosystem. That's the tactical thing I'm talking about, and that's like you're saying, that's those 10 to 30%, headcount reduction numbers that people are looking for in the near term. So that I think that's one.
That makes sense. So I have a few more questions, but let's see if people in the audience have. I know you've got them.
So Bradford and Arindam, and I take your dystopian or utopian slice on this. so as someone who has worked on AI and machine learning for many, many years, where there was not just a single agent who was learning, but multiple agents who are learning at the same time, my question to you is this. Many of the assumptions in most of machine learning is that, I'm the sophisticated one, I have the know-how to run machine learning, and everybody else is pretty much static. And so there's a data set comes in, to your point, and I can do slice and dice in many ways. But my question is, what happens in your view when you are not the only one, sophisticated one using machine learning for AML, but the adversaries, the counterparties, or your peers are also using machine learning and AI to beat your system?
Right.
And to that point, to your earlier dystopian or utopian estimates, so I want to kind of hear your perspectives, and to the extent what your thoughts are about, not just in AML but in general, when everybody's using their AI software to game everybody else.
Right, so it's a great question. I think we mentioned earlier that I started my career in hedge funds actually first, but building the strategies and then later as a fund manager myself. And so I'm used to these adversarial, kind of domains. That's where I've spent a lot of time. So statistically what you're talking about is obviously the concept of like non-stationarity, right? So there's ways of modeling this. We've dealt with it in like financial markets for a long time. Cybersecurity is obviously another very important domain like this. So, building models on non-stationary data is something that we can do. It's harder, right, of course, but we can do it. Now, here's though, and this gets to something we talked about earlier a little bit in the sort of a prep for this. Like the rollout and the release process in banking is really adversarially aligned to the need for evolution of models because of the adversarial dynamics that you mentioned. So basically you're in this ecosystem and the bad guys are trying to get better and avoid your stuff. And then I can't change my models at all. And I can only roll them out once a year with this super elaborate like model validation thing. Whereas like in other domains, like in hedge funds or in Google or other any ad tech, right? They also have a lot of non-stationary data, and they're retraining their stuff all the time and pushing it out live all the time, right? So for me, the biggest issue in addressing the reality that you're discussing in FCC, it's not that we can't model non-stationary data, we don't know how. The problem is that we actually can't get into a release cadence that aligns to this need.
I think, yeah, no, those are great points, right? I think the release cadence is absolutely not at sync with, the speed at which you can innovate. I think the second interesting point, right, is you and I can have the same model, right? The same exact algorithm. But if I have more data, I'm at an advantage because my model is learning on the data, right? So I think, as every institution is now going to try and hoard more and more data, they're getting into the app business, as I mentioned earlier, so that they create more immersive experiences and they capture like more data about you through every interaction that you have. They're also looking at third-party data providers, right? So there's like a whole branch of third-party data providers just providing specialized data on individuals. So ultimately, I think data is going to win the war, right? Not just the algorithm.
Can I have one corollary to that? So what and Jeff, I want to hear from you. So one aspect was that what I'm hearing so far is you're still focusing on the data and modeling. But perhaps there's also a meta-level perspective on thinking of the game theoretic perspective, the nonlinear dynamics. When is that going to come in? I mean, you can stay at the data level and say that, I'm going to build faster or build slower. You can do that, I can understand it. Yeah. But also, you may need a bigger picture, right? What are the perhaps from a game, I'm just making it up, perhaps from a game theoretic perspective, these are the key 3 strategies that are going on. Or from, pick your field of expertise, but using that to apply in the model building, in kind of give you a holistic picture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that what will happen over time, which you're starting to get into there, is that the tech and legal frameworks need to come together more and evolve, together. In the most trivial example that we talked about earlier, this would be like the red flag rules for AML. So the red flag rules, if anyone's ever sat down and read them, should very obviously just be turned into code, right? And like the parts which are left fuzzy, they should just be like, we need to clarify those. There's no point to leave it like that. It should just be, something that's like codable. And you start to get to the next level and you have statistical modeling, and then there the precedent, I would say, is probably like disparate impact, right? Where we think about like stats, and you need to sort of like write things up from a perspective of stats. I personally think that the guidance that's been authored on this is abysmally bad, and they obviously didn't bring in any people who understand statistics, and I think it's hugely problematic. So this issue where the legal community and the statistical and modeling community need to come together to sort of forge that path forward is a serious one. And it does get into things like what you're talking about. It's like, what's the intent? What are you, if you're doing a really good job with your compliance program and you have these controls in place, what do strong controls look like? And is there a way for me to mandate strong controls in a way that's technically more savvy and evolves faster to the tech? I think we're a long ways away from figuring out how to do that, but I do agree that it's like really important coming from a perspective of a technical person. It's, you always see how we're not able to think like this, right? And at the meta level. But, I think we're a decade away from honestly being able to do that. I'm happy to just get like the rules right at this point. But do you have a, no?
Yeah. Well, on that last point, I guess the one part I would comment on is, there is work being done to try to kind of, achieve part of that vision and to kind of automate regulation in terms of so that rules and handbooks are in machine readable and machine executable code. Again, the FCA in the UK has done that with a number of sections. The CFTC, I think, will be working on that soon. Other US regulators are looking at it. There's a lot of communication. So, it kind of creates, some interesting challenges based on kind of some of the work that's been done thus far. So, one of them is that, sometimes, so these tech firms have come in and kind of looked at the language and tried to tease out the meaning and sort of come up with kind of standardization, put everything into triplets and stuff, so you can run with it. And so sometimes what they find is that, the same word, even within, the same kind of body of provisions or some, is actually used in 2 slightly different meanings. And then they've got to figure out, well, which meaning is it? So how do you do that? So if you're the firm in private industry, you can have your lawyers and compliance people and your tech advisors try to figure that out, and you would hope to get it right, but you might get it wrong, and then what's the consequence to you? So then the alternative is, well, will the regulator just tell you? So in these sort of experiments, since the regulator had engaged the tech firm to sort of do this work for it, they had access to regulatory feedback, so they had a greater degree of confidence that what you're getting is actually the intention. And by the way, the intention of that provision could have been written by people who left the agency you're at 30 years ago, but it's just been consistent, so it's kind of the interpretation of the people who were working there. But if you have the interpretation of the people who were there, there's some degree of confidence of that. But when you think of all the regulations in all the world, if kind of private companies are going to do this, regulators typically don't want to favor one private company over another private company. So you may not be able to go and kind of get their interpretation. So then you're introducing an element of risk, while you're making an educated guess about what you think those provisions mean. But then that goes really back to the question that you put at the outset, Penny, which is, can the regulators may be saying this, but can people rely on it if you don't have that absolute certainty that this regulation that's in machine readable and machine executable language, how do you know that actually reflects what the regulator intended? And these things are always judged, in hindsight when something bad has happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions? Yeah, Becky?
Can you talk about the prospect for federated learning? And by that I mean some of the, I'll say, fledgling attempts at interbank cooperation, or are we really just, do we have to resign ourselves to algorithmic learning as it applies, across financial institutions?
So I think in some areas we can see scope for federated learning, even though to your point, and I think you kind of alluded to it in your question, right? There has been little success till date, right? Any federated or consortium type of effort has kind of started and stopped. Where we are seeing a little bit of traction is around KYC. So if you're going to onboard the same customer, if there's a standard way of doing KYC and really doing risk modeling around the customer, can the banks agree on it? And then once you have been onboarded in the central application, can banks start to do business with you, right? It's not it's non-differentiated, so there is more opportunity for banks to cooperate in this area. But when it comes to fraud detection or even detection of like risk modeling and stuff like that, I think we are ways away from that.
How do you do it without sharing data that you don't want your competitors to see? I think that's, and just getting these big bang with people with big egos to agree on something is always pretty hard.
Yeah, so remarkably, we've actually been able to do this already. So we learn already on data from multiple different financial institutions. And I think there's a lot of nuance to what we mean when we say federated learning, and when we talk about aggregation of data and learning from multiple different data sets. So there's like proper federated learning from like an infrastructure perspective, where I literally have like a learner in 20 different financial institutions, and my learner is learning weights, and then I export those weights, and then I have some like meta learner that's doing something with those weights, and that's like really federated learning. But the reason for doing this would be that if I can't pass data out of the bank, like PII data, right? So I can only pass out weights. So then the theoretical argument is therefore I can like export these bunch of numbers, right? Not quite, because actually I have to export all the features together with the numbers, and the features are, if it's a well-designed system, will include a whole variety of different stuff that definitely legal will be concerned about, and there needs to be like a big discussion about. So it's not so simple that you just create some numbers and abstract away the PII issue. It's a little trickier than that. So I think the much more realistic thing, which is happening right away, and like literally we're doing it right now and like killing it on this, so definitely it works, is just getting data from the different institutions in a setting that's not requiring you to access like all this like mega core crown jewels data, right? So like, for example, you can run POCs and then get a bunch of data from the POC, right? And there's different data which people will export under certain circumstances. So I think that most likely we'll continue to see this story of aggregation of data outside the banks, and I'm seeing it happen honestly faster than I would have imagined. And we even had a situation in the past year where we've had many orders of magnitude more data from a new big POC client than we had from an existing production client. So, because there was much more sensitivity around exporting some of this stuff, right? And that POC data was extraordinarily valuable to increase the precision of our models in certain ways, because this financial institution had labeled a lot of really interesting stuff which wasn't in our other data set. So I see this kind of like aggregated data and learning on the aggregated data happening faster. And then I see this federated learning model, which was what I originally thought about, and we actually had this in our pitch decks and everything at some point. But I think it's trickier than it seems, and you start to get into the weeds and realize like actually it's going to take quite a lot of work, and then you start to realize, and by that I mean not necessarily the technical work, but really like the legal compliance and the buy-in and all this stuff, right? And the diplomatic work is really the beast here. And in the end, you got to ask yourself, what are we getting? You know, if we can assemble this kind of like golden data set on the outside, like Stephen, my partner in crime, was one of the early execs at Montas, and they've had built a golden data set outside the banks at Montas for quite a long time ago. And so I think this is an established precedent. You can do this. You can get data out of the financial institutions. Again, you have the luxury that now I can hire all these different FCC firms, like all the big four folks and so on. I can bring them in, I can have them label data. So my suspicion is that we move to a world of more aggregated data, even with some PII information outside the banks, and that the federated learning stuff is going to be like maybe a pipe dream, which is like totally different than what I would have told you 3 years ago.
One or two more? Any other questions?
How do you face the challenge of I guess, dual challenges of selling into a cost center? Right, it's not something that like the leadership of the bank is necessarily super excited about, and a lot of your pitch must be, we'll save you X amount of dollars down the line, kind of preventative medicine, and that's just a difficult psychological challenge, I think, for humans to wrestle with. And then also the challenge of how much more does this demonstrate to regulators that you're really trying, right? Like there's kind of the narrative around, we spend X amount of dollars. I worked on a couple years back now a value at risk system that had been broken for months at a time at a multi-billion-dollar trading desk, and basically people didn't care, right? Like they cared, but it wasn't a big rush. And so how do you face the challenge of that narrative that gets sold to the regulators versus actually implementing that work and making a change in their systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you go after a business like this kind of a space, timing is everything, and you have to have a massive, massive stack of catalysts, right? So we were very, very thoughtful and deliberate about how we chose this business. Like it wasn't a random thing that I thought was a good idea or something. Like I have a whole finance team that works with me on venture selection. Like this is a pretty gnarly process. So listen, everybody's buying this stuff left and right. Like every bank CEO has some kind of initiative in their top 3 KPIs for fixing AML. Like it's one of the biggest problems in the entire industry. The spend is crazy. Like, I mean, Jamie had a reimagined KYC thing last year, like as one of his top 3 things in the whole JP Morgan chase, right? So no, this is a big deal. People have to fix this immediately. The fines are crazy. The cost is spiraling out of control. And that's exactly why this is an amazing business right now. Because of what you said, you have this historically very difficult market to penetrate, and it is a cost center, and it is very unsexy, and people don't want to spend money on it from the executive level, right? Because it's not making them win. But when everybody's getting fined billions of dollars and your headcount is escalating out of control and your big bank spending $2-3 billion on compliance annually, then you start to be like, yo, like this is out of control, right? And so I think we've reached the point where it's literally broken the back of the global banking system. And they can't innovate either. Like if you go around in these banks, nobody will do anything new. And the reason is mostly compliance, right? It's so hard for them to do like digital innovation, for example. And so I think they realize this, like the stack of catalysts, whether it's the cost, the headcount, the risk and the fines, or the inability to innovate, it just piled up and piled up to the point where if you talk to any CEO of the top 50 banks, they will definitely tell you this is one of their top few problems. So that's the reality of the space right now. It's like that serious, right? It's like a CEO issue now. And so I think that's where we're at and why people are adopting and making decisions quickly. But it's not a window that's open forever, right? Like industries ebb and flow, and you see these kind of like deep core problems where people have to fix it in a mad rush for 5 years or so. And these are few and far between when you have one of these magical moments of rapid adoption and transformation. That's exactly what we're seeing right now in the FCC space. I think if we had started this business 6 years ago, we would already be dead, right? But instead, we're killing it, right? And it's just timing. You know? Yeah, I had one of my best mentor ever told me some people are lucky and they're born smart, and other people are much smarter and they're born lucky, right? So you want to be in the latter
Right. Excellent. On that note, I think we're out of time. I'd like to thank our panel, Bradford, Jeff, and Linda, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming. You've been a really